Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alexander Arefyev. I'm press attaché of the Russian Embassy in South Africa, and this is Alternative Viewpoint video series. Russia is in the spotlight of the Western mainstream media's attention again. This time, the reason being the draft documents on legal security guarantees from the United States and NATO, which have been given by Russia in December. The US was also given the detailed explanation regarding the logic of the Russian approach, as well as the relevant arguments. However, as usual, the Western media decided to follow their own path and started inventing their own explanations of Russia's actions. Let's have a look at some of the headlines where Russia is threatening the West again and is planning to invade Ukraine. Amid fears Russia will invade Ukraine, Putin points finger at US and NATO in marathon news conference. Washington Post. Vladimir Putin threatens military technical reaction to NATO over Ukraine. Deutsche Welle. Is Russia preparing to invade Ukraine? And other questions. BBC. It looks like they are trying to make things look as if Russia is blackmailing the West with its possible invasion of Ukraine. This is what the narrative of Russia amassing the troops at the border is all about. Well, it seems that the Western mainstream media got so addicted to this threadbare, aggressive Russia topic that they just can't take a broader look at the situation, or from a different angle at the very least. Well, let's try to observe it all from an alternative viewpoint. Though Ukrainian crisis indeed incited tensions between Russia and the West, those tensions did not begin in 2014, when an unconstitutional coup d'etat took place in Kiev with the support of some Western capitals and officials and other Western capitals and officials' acquiescence. Regardless of whether the Western mainstream media and experts truly believe that the Russian initiative of an agreement on security guarantees was all about Ukraine, or they just try to make you think that way, they are mistaken. The main reason behind Russia's decision is much broader. Russia does not believe the West. Not anymore. There were times when Soviet leadership decided to turn a new page in the history of USSR-West relations. For an illustration, here's a short extract from an interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, where he describes the sentiments that prevailed among Soviet leadership those days. We were building new relations between us. There was an unprecedented level of trust and an enormous desire to be friends, if not allies. Back then, many in our country, including among the political elite and even its supreme leaders, were driven by an honest desire to put an end to Cold War and restart the relationship with the West. We all know what happened. The arrogant West committed a terrible mistake. It sincerely believed in its definitive and irreversible victory in the Cold War. Remember Francis Fukuyama and his book, The End of History? Yet, as for Russians, we never felt defeated. We also believed that we would benefit, in particular from switching to a free market economy. So the West shook hands with the Soviet Union and then simply betrayed its trust by violating the promise not to expand NATO eastwards. And now, Russia wants a legal commitment from NATO to stop its further expansion. To quote Russian Foreign Minister again, this time we demand, this is the only option, legally binding security guarantees. Trust, but verify. Yes, many things could have gone otherwise back then. But that tremendous potential of the year 1991 was wasted. Why might ask? Maybe things have changed? What if the Western elites of present day have fully realized their mistake of the past and today approach the negotiations with Russia differently? What can we say to that? Our best hope is that the West realizes the seriousness of the current situation. The good news is that the first round of talks between Russia, US, and NATO took place. Yes, this is good news in its own right, as it demonstrates that both sides, Russia and the West, are at least interested in the dialogue. As one Russian saying goes, better a bad peace than a good quarrel. Realistically speaking, the peace nowadays, even a bad one, rests on something we call strategic stability. Washington has been consistently undermining the said stability by withdrawing from key agreements in the area: Treaty on Open Skies, INFT, ABMT. The international system of arms control is next to non-existent today due to these actions by NATO uncontested leader, the USA. Against this background, Russia expects tangible results. A lot of things need to be rectified. Probably there will be new rounds of negotiations in the future, but Russia made that clear that it is not interested in endless talks. It needs results that are acceptable. As Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko said at press conference, Russia expects the United States and other NATO countries to give a written response to Moscow's security initiatives and will decide whether it is reasonable to continue talks or move to other measures to ensure national security. So much for the good news. The bad news is that the West is reluctant to accept the new reality where it is no longer can impose its own will on all others. At the very least, this sentiment is dominating in the Western mainstream media right now. For example, here is a fragment from an interview of Edward Lucas, British journalist and security specialist, to Estonian broadcaster, ERR.
I think that there's a serious problem in the way the West looks at Russia, which is that we think that dialogue is good in itself. And so I feel that the response, whether it's from the United States or from the European Union institutions or from the big European countries, all failed to establish a kind of moral and psychological leadership.
The key word here is leadership. As if the West desperately needs to lead something, have an advantage, dominate. It seems that over the past few decades, the West just lost the habit of talking to someone as equals. And if you thought that the West is resorting to threats to Russia now because the situation is exceptional and requires some desperate measures to be taken, then we're afraid you're wrong. It is typical of the West to go for threats when a certain situation does not develop in accordance with its wishes. Our point is that decades of global dominance fostered a habit among Western elites to speak down on everyone else, as well as a certain perception of other countries. We believe that the quintessence of Western's approaches towards Russia was voiced by Petra Kozlov, journalist from BBC Russian service, at President Putin's annual press conference of 2021. In translation to English, his question goes like this. Probably you remember, he said, addressing Vladimir Putin, that each time power in Russia was concentrated in the hands of one person in the absence of active opposition, when Russia was in a state of active, acute confrontation with the West, ultimately this situation prompted a response which plunged the country into the abyss of wars and revolutions. Do you think that you, possessing all the power, are now laying the foundation, perhaps, for such wars and revolutions? Judging by this question, Mr. Kozlov has been completely brainwashed by Western propaganda, as he described things back to front. For one thing, being a Russian himself, he completely misunderstands Russian society and its values. The Russian people have always appreciated strong leadership. They always wanted a strong and a wealthy state that would take care of its people. If it's called paternalistic in the West, so be it. They don't care. In our humble opinion, this is one of the reasons of the current Russian president's popularity. Secondly, Mr. Kozlov has demonstrated outright absence of even basic knowledge of history. If anything, the consolidation of power in a state of acute confrontation with the West helped our country to get through the most challenging periods of its history. For example, Joseph Stalin. World War II started a little more than 20 years after World War I ended, which means that Soviet Russia and then USSR only had so much time to prepare itself for the most destructive war in humankind's history. The Soviet leadership, just like anyone else, saw the war coming. So, concentration of power in one hands allowed the Soviet Union to focus on its vital objectives, prepare itself for the conflict, emerge victorious in a fierce fight against Nazi Germany with basically entire Europe's economic and industrial potential behind it, Nazi Germany's satellites and other Axis powers, and ultimately save Europe from Nazi oppression. To our mind, the importance of Joseph Stalin's personal input in all this should not be underestimated. For a comparison, now let's have a look at World War I. Russia entered that war in fulfillment of its obligations to its allies from Entente bloc, UK and France. And what was the result? The Russian Empire has fallen, and a young state of Soviet Russia was abandoned by its former allies and left in diplomatic isolation. Moreover, Entente powers actively intervened, including militarily, in Russian civil war, dragging the conflict on and pouring oil on flames as Russians were fighting among themselves. Russia gained nothing from this alliance with Western powers. Another example comes from the 90s. The Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation was at its weakest. This is when the relations with the collective West truly flourished, when Russia was weak, passive in international affairs, and unable to help its allies. Is this the Russia that Mr. Kozlov wants to see? Is Russia's historic mission, in Mr. Kozlov's eyes, comes down to appeasing the West at the cost of surrendering its own pride, national interests, and sovereignty? We can hardly agree on that. In defense of Petra Kozlov's position, one might argue that regular alternation of power prevents usurpation of the said power. There is some truth to that. But to all those who think that staying in power for too long, whatever that means, is the ultimate evil, we would like to give two examples. The first one being the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who remained in power for 16 years, and nobody seemed to have any problem with that. At least we don't recall any articles in the media expressing concern about democracy and human rights in Germany being endangered. Former US President Donald Trump, on the other hand, was attacked by the media, politicians, academicians, celebrities from any conceivable angle, under any conceivable pretext, including the infamous so-called Russian interference in the US elections. Donald Trump was even labeled a dictator in the Western media and in the US media. But he stayed in the presidential office for only 4 years. See? The so-called dictatorship and authoritarianism the Western mainstream media keep whining about have nothing to do with how long do the politicians stay in power. It's pure propaganda. In fact, any government of any country can be declared by the West as authoritarian in a blink of an eye. If that serves the West's goals, of course. The most concerning part about all this is that the Western propaganda downgraded things like democracy, freedom of speech, pluralism of opinions, and human rights to mere propaganda cliches that have zero substance behind them. These words are now just empty shells of their former beings. The West respects democracy? but it openly interferes with other countries' domestic affairs, demonizes democratically elected leadership of foreign countries. What kind of adherence to democracy is this? The West respects the freedom of speech? No. It resorts to direct censorship of the media. Think Russia's Sputnik in Estonia or RT Deutsch in Germany. That's freedom of expression and pluralism of opinions for you. What about human rights? Well, the so-called migrant crisis at Belarus-Polish border was a perfect opportunity for the West to display its full commitment to human rights and high humanitarian standards. What do we see in reality, though? An outright slaughter. According to the information gathered by Belarusian Investigative Committee from Mr. Emil Czeszko, a Polish soldier who deserted Polish military, during the criminal case investigation, Emil Czeszko disclosed that he and his fellow servicemen had participated in organized murders in the border area and near the settlement of Siemianowka, Poland, starting on 8th of June 2021. According to the serviceman, he is aware of murder of over 240 people. This is what the Investigative Committee of Belarus said on its Telegram channel. So, was this discussed intensively in Western mainstream media? Of course not. They are conspiratorially silent. In conclusion, we would like to say that over the past decades, the West did everything in its power to make sure it loses Russia's trust, including by abandoning de facto the values it once was committed to and replacing them with hypocrisy and double standards. It is in this context Russia wants written security guarantees from the expanding NATO. The Western unease about that can already be seen. Yeah, as we said, force of habit. And all habits die hard. But we hope for the best, because hope is always the last to die. That is it for today. My name is Alexander Arefyev, and this was Alternative Viewpoint video series. Stay safe, stay tuned.